Welcome, everyone. Let's talk about social inclusion. Residents of Wilhelmsburg, a neighborhood in Hamburg, Germany, have been faced with issues relating to pollution, infrastructure, and poverty. In the 2000s, these residents formed a group called Future Wilhelmsburg, advocating for the community's future to be controlled by its residents rather than government elites. Today, we chat with Louis Volont, Chair of History and Theory of the City at HafenCity University in Hamburg, who, through the lens of Laurent Thévenot's pragmatic sociology, analyzed this community's endeavor to common its future. Hi, Louis. Welcome to our episode.
Hello. Thanks. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to have you. And I'll start by asking, how long have you been following this project? And what drew you to explore the Future Wilhelmsburg organization?
Well, following the project, this is something that came up quite recently in my academic endeavors. I would say only for the past 1.5 or 2 years or so. I've been talking informally to local activists and mainly analyzing their public discourse because they publish a lot of books, white papers, blog posts, and so on. But what drew me to analyze this was really a coming together of two of my main lines of interest in my own research. And the first line of interest is my interest in urban questions of urban commoning. So how social actors share like public spaces and streets and buildings and so on in order to protect them from capitalist intervention. So that's urban commoning. And a second line of interest, which is more prominent in my current postdoctoral research, is the idea of urban future making. So how do people imagine and materialize urban futures? And so this article and this case study is really a coming together of these two lines of inquiry, whereby I wanted to know, what if we think about the future, this dimension of time, the not yet, as a commons, which people can share, care for, reciprocate against the dynamics of capitalist or corporatist enclosure.
And to really understand how they are achieving those goals, you use a theoretical framework based on Laurent Thévenot's grammars of commonality to help understand what these efforts are. You outline in your article three conclusions that you relate to this way of approaching it. Can you briefly talk us through each of them?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, I'm a real fan of French neo-pragmatist, that's a mouthful, sociology, which has been emerging since the 90s by, among others, Luc Boltanski, but more recently also Laurent Thévenot. And he has this concept of grammars of commonality. And so he asks, or he motivates scholars to look at how do people commonalize something? What are the kinds of words and tactics and phrases and discourses they use to commonalize something, to turn something from an individual thing into something that is shared or collective, right? And so I use this as a sort of starting point to do exactly this, which I explained in the previous question. How do social actors commonalize the future? So how do they move beyond the individual towards the sharing of this fascinating thing, the future? And so looking at these three conclusions or insights, if you will, I could point to the following. So a first one was really my thesis that the commoning of the future emerges through what I call radical fixed images of the future. And I hope it's okay if I give a little example. So the
Sure.
commoners or the activists of Zukunft Wilhelmsburg, Future Wilhelmsburg, they were confronted with the question of the A26, and that is a big highway which is planned by the political level, and it's going to cross or to cut right through Wilhelmsburg. Now, they have been opposing this, And vice versa, the political and planning level, they have been proposing different varieties of the A26. They said, well, we can do an underground version, or we can do a version that is semi upper ground, half underground, and so on. So there was version XYZ of this highway. Whereas Future Wilhelmsburg said, no, we don't want to engage with this or that version or variety of this polluting highway. We want no highway. So commoning of the future emerges through fixed images. The radical option is what I called it in the article. Secondly, commoning of the future emerges through this, what I call a unseen layer of study work. So the activists that are trying to common the future, they go to great lengths to sit behind desks in study rooms at home to study, to check data, to really disentangle and excavate a certain topic. And let me give a second example of this, still about this A26 highway. So the political and the planning level, they justified this highway by saying, well, the number of containers that is handled in the Hamburg harbor, which is right next to Wilhelmsburg, is increasing every year. And so there's going to be more traffic, and we need, therefore, this highway. But then the commoners of the future, the activists of Future Wilhelmsburg, they checked this. They used public economic data. Is the number of containers in the Hamburg harbor really increasing? And they found out that it's actually the opposite trend. The number of containers is decreasing through time. So that is what I call justificatory study work. They go to great lengths to really check and double check data that are used by others. And finally, but also important, the coming of the future relies on moments of celebration and feast. For example, in the article I'm writing about the Spreehaven Festival, which is a yearly gathering of local commoners and activists where they share food, there are musical and theatrical performances and so on. And these are important moments. These are intense, short-lived but intense moments in which visions of the future are more palpable. They, as I express it in the article, they resort to the forefront of consciousness before fading away again. So these are three ways or grammars of commonalizing or commoning the future.
And you spoke about how, in different ways, this community has been fighting, the dispossession of of decision making in their own region. What do you feel? Do you feel like it is influencing other places? Do you feel like it can influence actual local governments to act upon these solutions by this community, or do you feel like they've been ignored so far?
Well, looking at it locally, I wouldn't say that it is ignored, because as I also describe in the article, there are many sessions like debate evenings, and public discussions and public hearings and so on, where precisely these two levels, and let's call it the bottom up and the top down, or the activists and the political level, come together. So there is mutual reciprocal dialogue. There is communication between these two levels, but that doesn't necessarily mean, of course, that that the efforts by the bottom up always succeed, right? But if we zoom out from the local level, I would argue that a lot is going on these days in a times of multiple crisis when it comes to future making. So corporations, politicians, activists, and so on, whatever level they are working on or thinking these days about futures, right? They're thinking about urban futures, food futures, fashion futures, even climate futures is, of course, a very important one. So there is something going on in the world we live in when it comes to future making. And I would say that, or I would say to future makers, that it is always important to really or to realize that the future can be ideally a commons. It can be something that is democratically deliberated vis-a-vis something that can always also be enclosed by politicians, corporations, and so on.
Absolutely. And you said you've known about this not too long. So a year and a half you've come in contact with this project and you've been working on knowing more about it. What struck you the most when encountering this project, what they've been doing? Something that maybe surprised you? Can you describe as the biggest thing that stuck out to you about this project?
Yeah, I would say, to use a French expression, because you know that I'm a fan of French sociology, the élan vital of the local commoners and activists. So the vital force that they have, the constant life force that continuously drives them to engage in struggle after struggle after struggle. It's maybe important to realize that Zukunft Wilhelmsburg already exists since the beginning of the 2000s. So since 2001, we are 2024 today. So that's almost 25 years. So that since day one, they feel this life-giving energy and urge to never give up. And maybe a little anecdote is that this question of the A26 highway, which I've used as an example, right before we came to this interview, I've been checking their blog website again to see where was it exactly that it started, this dossier in particular, and that was in 2011. And so to this day, 13 years later, it is still an ongoing struggle. No final decision has been made at the political or planning level, so no final planning documents have been signed to sign off the A26, but it's still going on, and they're still struggling against it.
And again, celebrating and planning and envisioning that future together is, I think, a very important piece in that vital force that they keep. It's because they never forget about what they are fighting for, and they
Exactly.
bring
Yeah.
people together over that shared idea of a future. So we're right at the end of this conversation, and we have this tradition here on the show to ask our guests to, in no more than two sentences, what do you want people to take away from our conversation today?
Yeah. Well, I would say it's a quite simple one for me, and it would be the following. Uh, the future is a commons, right? It is a sort of temporal not yet, which on the one hand can be democratically discussed, but can always is always potentially subject to enclosure. And in a time of multiple crises, it's the former route of democratic deliberation which seems more desirable to me.
Absolutely. Louis, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your research in this lovely project.
My pleasure.
Um, if you're watching us on YouTube, you can find all the resources and materials of this conversation on the Let's Talk About Social Inclusion website. You can also listen to this episode whenever you get your podcasts, subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on X at Cogitatio LTA. My name is José Batista, and I'll see you on the next one.